These events occurred in the summer of '73 in the Adirondacks, and nothing like this had ever occurred, where we had a monster roam in the countryside.
Hi there, it's WAMC News Director Ian Pickus. And on this episode of the WAMC News Podcast, Sworn to Silence, we speak about a terrifying moment in the Adirondacks 50 years ago. Well, in 1973, one of the largest manhunts in New York State history occurred after Robert Garrow killed 4 people in the Adirondacks. He was apprehended after 12 days. His trial, which became known as the Missing Bodies case, is studied to this day because his lawyers knew but did not reveal the location of 2 missing bodies, citing attorney-client confidentiality. In the book Sworn to Silence, The Truth Behind Robert Garrow and the Missing Bodies case, author Jim Tracy writes about the murders, Garrow, and the lawyers. Our Pat Bradley spoke with Tracy for the 50th anniversary of the manhunt. Here's their interview.
These events occurred in the summer of '73 in the Adirondacks, and nothing like this had ever occurred, where we had a monster roam in the countryside. He had murdered campers in the Adirondacks, and then he was on the loose for several days, almost 2 weeks. And many people alive today were 18, 19, and they were camping there. And there was roadblocks throughout the whole area. So a lot of people remember it. And there hasn't been a lot of factual information about the case to come out in the years after. There's been a lot of urban legend and stuff. So often the reviews are saying that people thought they knew the case until they read this book. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as they say, truth is stranger than fiction. There's so many twists and turns with this case that it really ranks up there with popular true crime books like In Cold Blood and Helter Skelter. It's just a fascinating case, particularly for people in the Northeast who remember this.
You wrote for a newspaper and you did a series on the Robert Garrow crime, and that led you to writing the book. How did you become intrigued about Robert Garrow and the history of his murder spree?
During the manhunt in 1973, when I was 8 years old, we got a call from state police saying that he had broken into my father's hunting camp. So we went up there. Of course, I was scared to death, but, I trusted my father. I did not know at the time Garrow had stolen a car near the camp and gone an hour and a half north to where he was from originally, Mineville, Witherby in Essex County near Port Henry, Ticonderoga area. And so we went to the hunting camp, and he had placed a card table in front of the door. The door was padlocked from the outside, and he had slithered through the transom above the door, the little window, and his big boot print was on the card table. And when he was finally shot and captured, he had clothes on from the camp. He had a green sweatshirt that said Allegan, Michigan. And the funny thing was he had a Mickey Mouse T-shirt on, which was memorable because the guy that used to wear the Mickey Mouse T-shirt to camp, he often got picked on a little bit and kidded because he wore a Mickey Mouse T-shirt to hunting camp. So lo and behold, when Garrow's captured, that's what he had on. He had stolen clothes from our camp. And he had walked up the road. It was Monday, August 6th. He had walked up the road from our camp early in the morning after staying overnight. And there was a Christian boys camp called Deerfoot Lodge. And he found a 1968 Pontiac Tempest with the keys in it. And he stole the car, and he ran a roadblock, and the trooper pursuing broke down, and Garrow was on the loose again. So having gone through all that myself, I had been to that camp before, following my father around with a BB gun, as a 6 and 7 year old kid, just learning how to hunt and stuff. And then at 8 to find out that he had been in the camp. So I was intrigued with it all that time. And when I was working at the newspaper, I suggested to the crime writer, because I was in sports, that he should maybe write about the 25th anniversary of this. For whatever reason, he didn't want to. So one of the editors encouraged me to do it. So I wrote a 6-day series on it, and it was such a success that I decided it needed to be a book. And so while raising a family and working, I wrote part-time on this book, and I did about 9 years of research, and it came out in 2021, and still selling strong today. That's how I got involved, as him breaking into our camp.
Jim Tracy, you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of urban legends about Robert Garrow and his murder, rape, crime spree in the Adirondacks. How difficult was it to retrace exactly what he did, especially since there's a lot of people that believe he did more than what he was arrested and charged with?
It was difficult because there had been a book and a movie out, 2 books and a movie out with a lot of misinformation. And so you really had to dig deep. I was lucky in the sense that as a reporter, I was able to track down a lot of the participants who had never been interviewed before that played major roles in this. And they felt comfortable talking because so much time had passed. And I was able to obtain from the New York State Police Central Bureau of Records their case file on Garrow, which was massive. And I was also able to obtain the trial transcript and interview, like I said, numerous people that were involved. So I was able to kind of get the facts, and I even came across one couple who was abducted by him and managed to escape. Their names had always been mentioned, but no one could ever locate them. I was able to locate them. So it was difficult because you're battling a lot of false stuff out there. And the newspapers, which they say is the first draft of history, naturally police are not going to tell reporters everything in the 1973 newspapers, and there's going to be translation issues. So, some of the newspaper stuff that was out there was not correct, to no one's fault, except you're doing a story for the first time. And like I said, it's the first draft of history. So yeah, it was difficult in that sense to try to get away from what was rumor and what was fact.
You mentioned there had been a lot of misinformation. What was some of that, and what were some of the facts that you uncovered?
First, that Garrow was tagged as a spree killer, that he had killed 4 people in this short period of time, 3 of them in the Adirondacks, but he had been doing these types of crimes since 1968 when he was released from prison. This is what he did. He was a serial rapist, and if he got upset or if a woman fought, he would kill him. A lot of rape victims survived. That was one thing. There was a big rumor that his son, who helped him escape prison, was dead by suicide, which is not true. The son is alive. Things like that. A lot of things like that were false.
Do you think that he was caught in part because some of the victims, the victims that I think were initially found and he was initially charged for, were associated with, I believe it was George McGovern, and they were vacationing in the Adirondacks. Do you think if it hadn't been for their high profile that he would have gone on and just kept committing these crimes?
McGovern played a role in this because he had killed a McGovern employee, but ultimately, 2 weeks after he killed the McGovern employee, there was another murder 40 minutes away with the same MO exact, and they were able to identify Garrow. He had abandoned his car, and through eyewitnesses that had seen him. That really led to them pursuing Robert Garrow. And then ultimately how he was caught was they knew he had traveled through electronic surveillance, through phone taps. They knew he had visited his sister in Mineville, and they caught his nephew bringing him food. And that really broke open the case, that the nephew was bringing him food.
Now, this was 50 years ago, so they didn't have things like DNA evidence and things like that.
No, they had very limited technology and resources.
How did that affect how you approached the book and your research?
I don't know if it affected it, but what I knew was if this was going on today, he would have never got away with what he got away with because of back then there was no cameras, no DNA, no cell phones, and rape at the time. A lot of them went unreported because it was a stigma. It's still some go unreported today, but back then a lot more went unreported, and also there was a lot of we were coming off 58,000 people being killed in Vietnam, and it was just a strange period. Hitchhiking was popular. Girls not wearing bras, was popular, and he would find these targets of opportunity just driving around, and kids be a little bit more open to talking to somebody like that because we didn't know a lot about serial killers and rapists and stuff like that, and he was a charming individual. I mean, he could converse, and but yes, that was the big thing why he got away with it so long. And with talking about DNA and other resources that like today it would never happen.
Oh, Jim Tracy, one of the intriguing things about your book is that you don't necessarily just focus on Robert Garrow and the crimes that he committed. You also take a look and delve into his lawyers and what his defense lawyers did and went through. They are recognized now in law schools for what they did. Can you explain to the listeners why that's the case?
Yes, they're actually studied worldwide. There's, in Poland, Germany, we found they've studied the Garrow case in ethics. What happened? His lawyers were debriefed by Garrow and admitted to all these crimes. And part of the crimes was where two girls' bodies were located. And he, to confirm the veracity of what Garrow was telling him, the two lawyers went and found the bodies. And they decided that without his permission, because of attorney-client privilege, they couldn't reveal to the parents or authorities where these victims were. So during the course of his trial, during testimony, it came out that they knew all along where these bodies were. And when that happened, it became a national story. The trial was held in Hamilton County in Lake Pleasant, the least populous county in New York State. And media from all over the country came, LA Times, Newsweek, New York Times, to find out how two officers of law could keep this secret when police and authorities and family were desperate to find these girls. So they were brought up on ethic charges, disbarment proceedings. One of the lawyers was indicted. After the dust settled, they were cleared of any wrongdoing, but they became villainized across the country, and particularly in Syracuse, where they lived, for keeping this secret of where these victims' bodies were. And about 25 years after the case, newspapers started doing look-back stories on the case, and one of the attorneys, Frank Armony, he began going to law schools and lecturing on why he did what he did. And he spun his own, like a good lawyer, he spun his own narrative on why he did everything he did. And law schools started giving him awards, and he's recognized for his vehement defense of a client under incredible circumstances. And so a lot of schools give out awards. Syracuse University gives out the Frank H. Armani Trial Award. And across the country, he's been recognized.
This is a situation of a lawyer's right not to incriminate his client.
Yes, Fifth Amendment.
The Fifth Amendment. How difficult was it for the lawyers themselves during this period of time? I understand it was stressful for them. How stressful? How difficult was it for them?
It ruined both their lives. There was two lawyers, Francis Belge and Frank Armony. Mr. Belge, he thought of every possible way to give the information out legally and couldn't come up with a solution. His wife even wanted to write a letter anonymously and go out of state and mail it to the parents to tell them where the location of the bodies were. He ultimately decided that the information was coming from him, so it would still be illegal. He was one of the top defense lawyers in New York State, and he eventually started drinking heavily during the trial and got sick with alcoholism, and he left his family, moved to Florida, and died of a heart attack fueled by alcoholism at I think he was 65 years old. He was young. And Armani suffered several heart attacks, lost his eyesight, became legally blind. And so it had a tremendous effect on these people. There was no way for them to rationalize to the families why they did what they did. But Belgie was versed in constitutional law, and in a legally purist sense, there was no way to turn his own client in. Armani actually was on the fence, and he sought legal counsel from a high-ranking New York State judge on the Court of Appeals, and the judge said, no, you can't release the information without Garrow's permission. But at the time, in 1973, 74, people they just couldn't understand it. They didn't make sense to them that they would do this.
Was the information ever released?
Yes. The two bodies, Sue Petz and Alicia Hawk, were found by passersby in December of 1973, about 3 months after the lawyers had found them. The lawyers stood by Garrow at the time, denying that he had anything to do with it. During the course of testimony in the summer of 74, it came out in the trial that they had known all along where the bodies were. And that's when everything exploded around the country. And they started being threatened that they had broke the law and that they were going to be disbarred. They even went to the extent of, when they first found the bodies, they had a meeting with state police and the prosecutors from the two counties where the girls were found, Onondaga, Hamilton, Essex. And they wanted to exchange their location for a reduced charge to put Garrow in a mental home. But state police and the prosecutors wouldn't go for it. So they were stuck with it at that point, that information, when the state refused to bargain with them. So they thought of every way to give this information out without breaking the law or, being disbarred. And ironically, at the end, disbarment proceedings took place. They were no-billed and everything was thrown out, but they suffered terribly.
Jim Tracy, as you were writing the book and researching Garrow's crimes, and you started writing about the lawyers, how important did it become to include the lawyers' stories with Garrow rather than having maybe a separate book about the lawyers?
Yes, it was a lot of material to cover. So I divided the book into 4 sections: the murders, the ethical dilemma that the lawyers were facing, the trial, and then an aftermath. The ethics is probably the most intriguing part of the whole story. And it's the part that most people did not know about. When Garrow was captured on August 9th, 1973, the story ended for 99% of the people. Police had him and it was over with. But for some people, the story was just beginning, and that was the fight over where the bodies were. Because state police had made a conscientious effort to not kill Garrow because they wanted to know where bodies were. And that prolonged the manhunt because he had been spotted. He could have been shot. And they didn't do it. And when they finally captured him, he was interrogated pretty hard for a couple days, or very hard, and then the police tried every avenue to get this information out of him, and they couldn't. Yet he turned around and told his 2 lawyers everything. So it became a mess. one of the missing girls' sister was actually in school with one of the lawyer's daughters at Bishop Ludden High School in Syracuse. And, of course, the daughter didn't know anything except that Alicia Hawk was still missing. And then it came out that her father had known all along, so it became a mess. She had her friends, and Alicia Hawk's sister had her friends, but, it was a terrible time. And she even, the daughter of the lawyer even approached him and said, could you find out about Cindy Hawk's sister? And her father could not say a word. He knew, but she went to him because he knew everybody in the city of Syracuse. He was an attorney, and they suspected she was a runaway. So here's this poor lawyer. His daughter comes to him. He had seen her body and asked, could you help us locate this girl? And he couldn't do anything. So it was a terrible mess, and it ruined both of them.
Jim Tracy, a lot of people think Garrow killed more people than he was charged with. Having written this book, what do you think? Do you think he got away with more murders and that there are bodies that were never found?
Absolutely. The man who led this whole investigation with the Bureau of Criminal Investigation Unit of the New York State Police, a man named Henry McCabe, who was from Brooklyn and was upstate in the Glens Falls area as the senior investigator. He pursued this like a religion, and he was convinced there was more murders based on a map he found in Garrow's car that was marked, and some of the marks matched the murders they knew of. And he thought the murders were in the 20s. And in 2000, when I did the newspaper story, things had died down quite a bit. It's a couple decades later. And I asked Garrow's lawyer, Frank Armony, what he thought of McCabe's theory. And Frank, I could tell he didn't like the question, but he was professional. He put his head down for a minute, looked between his legs, and he mumbled, what can they do to me now? And he lifted his head and he said, go with what McCabe says. Garrow claims he was having these headaches. He would go out on the prowl. He'd pick up hitchhikers, use them, and kill them. And I would say his days off from work, Wednesdays and Saturdays, were spent doing this. And he mentioned one case, which was a girl named Martha Allen, whose case is still unsolved. She was found in a creek near a state campground. I think it's Oneida, near Oneida. And he said, he gave me that one. But between McCabe and Armani admitting that what McCabe told me was correct, I believe there were a lot more. So now, whenever I look into these cold cases from that time period, you find some that fit them like a T. Particularly on his map, all the markings were in New York State, except one was in Hamilton, Ontario, which is a 3-hour drive from Garrow's home in Syracuse via the New York State Thruway. There was a girl killed in May of 1973 named Adele Komorowski. The murder's unsolved, and there's quite a bit on the internet about it. There's a documentary on it. But Garrow had marked, that was the only marking outside of New York, like I said. He had circled Hamilton, Ontario, and he had written #13 ? And I think the question mark was because he didn't know her name. He used to follow the names in the newspapers, but because this was in Ontario and he went back to Syracuse after that, I don't think he knew her, found out her name back in those days, And that's the most obvious one. And if you read about it, it was his MO to the T. He dragged her into the woods. The witness, it was midnight, but there was a witness in the window and said that the man had incredible strength because he had the woman by the wrist and he was dragging her effortlessly, even though the witness could tell she was fighting. But he was known for his enormous strength. And a car, orange Volkswagen, was spotted near there, which was what he drove at the time. 2 other eyewitnesses described a husky man. So everything pointed to him. And that one's still unsolved. Hamilton, Ontario police don't believe it was him. But state police had sent the FBI up there, and they have correspondence from the FBI that Garrow was a suspect, but it got cut off shortly after Garrow's capture. They think it was because the lawyers cut off all communications. And another one that sticks out is a woman she was a 17-year-old student at DeSalle High School in Utica named Joanne Pescione, who was killed on Garrow's day off on a Wednesday near a school, which was his MO. Hands tied professionally with a rope to a tree, and she was killed. And the district attorney blamed someone else for it and closed the case. He took a lot of heat for it because at the time it was an election year and he was behind in the polls, and he came out with this name of a man named John Hopkins, who did later kill 2 people, 5 or 6 years later. And his MO was a lot different. And Hopkins was only 18 at the time of this crime, and he had just graduated high school. And this was a very brazen and professional attack in broad daylight. So there are cold cases out there. Rolling Stone, they did a big story on a young couple, 16 or 17, named Mitchell Weiser and Bonnie Bickwit, who disappeared going to the Watkins Glen concert in 1973, which has been in the news because it's the 50th anniversary of Watkins Glen. That is a possible Garrow abduction, too. The investigators think he was in the Adirondacks because he arrived Friday, July 27th. They were taken on the day of Friday, July 27th. So he was in the Syracuse area that afternoon. That case is the weakest of all, but that's a possibility. They've never been seen since in the 50 years. They were hitchhiking to Watkins Glen, which is not far from Syracuse. There's quite a few cold cases out there that he's responsible for.
Your book has been optioned basically for a possible movie.
Yes.
How much control will you have to make sure that it stays accurate to the book and that it doesn't try to imagine what might have happened, say, with some of these cold cases that we don't know for sure if Garrow was actually involved in?
Well, I didn't know a lot about Hollywood, but I've learned a lot since with authors. Basically, Hollywood has a license to do anything they want with it. So I have very little control over it. There's a lot less legalities in Hollywood than there is in book writing. I know recently the movie The Green Book, I don't know if you saw that. It was about a mafia guy that escorted a black musician in the 50s and 60s through the South. And The Green Book was originally a book and turned into a movie. But they sued the movie people because of inaccuracy. So, yeah, so when it goes to Hollywood, there's very little control unless you're Steven Spielberg or someone like that. Even Stephen King has said that I think he has 30 or 40 movies out based on his books, and he said none of them were good except I think one. I think The Shining, he said was okay. Yeah, you do lose that control.
Even with the loss of control, how excited are you that it's been optioned for a movie?
Yeah, it's very exciting. It really, really came out of the blue. You know, I actually have a literary agent who went out to L.A. and did all this, and he really didn't tell me because I think he didn't want me to get overexcited until the deal was done. And then he got back to me, and he did make a pretty good deal with it. But now a lot of these things a lot of books get optioned because people pay a small fee to option them. Like a $5,000 to $10,000 type fee just to have control of it. But they don't get made for various reasons. But as they'll tell authors, it's free money. So hopefully this one looks like it will be made because a production company called 87 North has taken over it. They did the John Wick series and they did Bullet Train last year. NBC Universal optioned it. They want to play on Hulu as like a 4 or 5 day series, similar to a successful project that was called Banner of Heaven about the Mormon Church that was a hit a couple years ago based on a John Krakauer book. So yeah, it's very exciting, even if it doesn't get made. Like, the worst case scenario was a little bit of free money.
Sworn to Silence, The Truth Behind Robert Garrow and the Missing Bodies Case is published by Post Hill Press and distributed by Simon & Schuster.
Okay, that does it for this episode of the WAMC News Podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks to Pat Bradley for that interview. Until next time, I'm Ian Pickus.